I am Dan Sportiello. I teach philosophy here. I know many of you. I was surprised, delighted, and honored to receive the Faculty Excellence Award to give you this talk today. I don't know if this is good news or bad news. The talk is actually not terribly long, so I thought that that was good and that it would give us plenty of time for question and answer. Ideally, you would have the questions and I would have the answers, though we'll see. If I turn out to be wrong about that, apologies in advance. But my thought is, if you have any questions while we're talking, just raise your hand and we can pause. Though I hope that what I'm saying isn't terribly hard to follow, though I've been in the weeds of this for a little while, so I'm not sure I'm the best judge. Basically, I do have a slideshow here, but this is just going to be the big quotations I'll be reading through. So I'm just going to read the paper, which is something I don't usually do. Hopefully it's not too boring. If it gets boring, feel free to leave. I assure you, you'll still get whatever extra credit you've been promised. Are we ready to go? Okay. I'll just start. I hope that the people in the booth are doing whatever recording they need to do. Let's go. Okay. So I call this the firstborn child of humanity for reasons that I hope will soon become obvious. So there's a lot of reasons to have a child. Some are bad. It would be wicked and also pretty stupid to have a child that have more help around the house, right? There are also good reasons to have a child, I think. The most obvious is that the child would be happy. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best, it's just sort of the most obvious one, right? Why have a child? One reason is because they would appreciate it, right? Okay. Arguably, there's another reason worthy of consideration. I had my children, at least in part, so they could actualize the potentialities that I myself could not. Paradigmatically, so that they could be better people than I was myself. It's crucial that in doing this, they'd be building on the foundation I had given them. Indeed, it's for this reason I'd call such children better people. Obviously, humans have been doing this, having children for generations. But it seems plausible that within my lifetime, humanity will have a child for the first time. In other words, it seems plausible that we're only a few years or decades from building an artificial general intelligence. Really, it seems plausible that we're only a few years or decades from building a superintelligence. In other words, an intelligence more than human. Were we to do that, were we to build a superintelligence, what goals ought we give it? Initially, that might seem like an easy question, right? For example, why not tell it to eradicate deadly diseases? Sounds pretty good, right? It turns out, though, that it's really hard to articulate any goal that isn't open to catastrophic misinterpretation. So, to take this example, the easiest way to eradicate deadly diseases is to eradicate the humans afflicted by those diseases, right? So, you would have to be careful, but it turns out, it sounds funny, but then the harder you think about it, the more you realize almost any instruction translated into computer programming is going to be open to this kind of catastrophic misinterpretation, or rather, we shouldn't risk humanity's existence on the fact that merely because we haven't thought of a way in which the instruction isn't open to catastrophic misinterpretation. Nonetheless, an intelligence far smarter than us won't figure out a way to misinterpret it that way. So what do you tell it? So I want to talk about a guy named Yudkowsky, Eliezer Yudkowsky, who is a little bit of a nut, but an interesting guy. And he argues that in order to avoid such misinterpretation, we ought to give any superintelligence precisely one goal. He calls it coherent extrapolated volition. We ought to tell such an intelligence to do whatever we would have told it to do if we knew more, thought faster, were more the people we wished we were, had grown up farther together, unquote. While he considers coherent extrapolated volition primarily as a way to make a superintelligence safe, what I want to talk about today is coherent extrapolated volition as a way to make that superintelligence good. In other words, to make the superintelligence what we ought to be but aren't yet. Indeed, if we have a responsibility to build such an intelligence, then this is a crucial reason why. So let me delve into the weeds here a little more about what we're even talking about. So the next section, I'll call it coherent extrapolated volition, or for short, I'll sometimes say CEV, okay? What does that mean exactly? So Yudkowsky writes eloquently of our predicament. Humanity has survived so far only because, for most of our history, we faced existential risks that were merely natural, right? Asteroid impacts, say. But we now face artificial existential risks, nuclear war, engineered pandemics, and so on, right? That's hardly the whole list. To survive, we've got to somehow reduce these risks drastically. Ultimately, it's not obvious that as we are, we can do this. So here, I'll turn to Yudkowsky. If we postulate that future minds exhibit the same mixture of foolishness and wisdom, the same mixture of heroism and selfishness as the minds we read about in history books, then the game of existential risk is already over. We lost it from the beginning. We might survive for another decade, even another century, but we definitely won't survive for another million years. I have to admit, that strikes me as plausible, right? Especially as economic and technological progress exponentially increase humanity's power over nature, including our power to do dumb stuff to ourselves, right? Like, the example I like to use is, how many decades is this going to be before a single disgruntled teenager in his garage can build the deadliest virus that's biologically possible, right? I'm not confident that I won't live to see that. Do you see what I mean here? Okay. So obviously, Yudkowsky isn't the only one to argue that we face an unsustainable level of existential risk. Toby Ord wrote a whole book about this. However, the solutions that Ord suggests, things like national regulations, international treaties, and so on, they don't seem nearly sufficient. It's easy to imagine regulations and treaties reducing the risks of engineered pandemics and nuclear war. But it's really hard to imagine regulations and treaties eliminating those risks, and on the relevant timescale, even reduced risks are unsustainable. But Yudkowsky suggests a solution rather more radical. The human mind is not the limit of the possible. Homo sapiens, you know who that is, right? That's us. Okay. Homo sapiens represents the first general intelligence. We were born into the uttermost beginning of things, the dawn of mind. With luck, future historians will look back and describe the present world as an awkward in-between stage of adolescence, when humankind was smart enough to create tremendous problems for itself, but not quite smart enough to solve them. So you get the idea. If we're going to mitigate these existential risks meaningfully, or even ideally eliminate them, we're going to need to become a lot smarter, right? But we can't get smarter merely by wanting to get smarter. Indeed, getting smarter probably means building a superintelligence, building an offspring smarter than we are. In other words, we've got to build a superintelligence to save us from ourselves, to save not only our lives, but also our way of living. Take an obvious example, the threat of climate change. We're now aware that economic progress comes at a tremendous environmental cost, and yet, apparently, we're unwilling to forsake further economic progress. Indeed, in the case of developing countries, that unwillingness is pretty understandable. How dare developed countries forbid them from enjoying the same prosperity, they may say. The only solution really, by the way, this is a thesis that stands free of the rest of the paper. It's somewhat depressing, but I think the only solution to climate change is rapid technological progress. The idea that we're going to convince people to just burn less fossil fuels seems increasingly implausible. We just need to make it cheaper to not do that. I'm hardly the first to say that, right? What we need really is energy that's both clean and cheap, say from fusion reactors, but we've now been trying to build fusion reactors for decades. It's reasonable to hope that a superintelligence would succeed where we have failed. Of course, technological progress would probably generate new existential risks, making it easier, for example, to engineer pandemics. But putting our civilization into the hands of a superintelligence, allowing it, in other words, to police us, would presumably solve many such problems. Indeed, putting our civilization in the hands of a superintelligence would presumably mean an end to war, including, of course, nuclear war. Today, how have we done it so far? We've tried a few different things over the past 75,000 years. You know, some have gone better than others. Today, we rule ourselves through humans whom we choose, humans who, whatever their virtues, continue to have human intellectual and moral vices. In other words, sometimes they're dumb and bad, right? You've noticed this? The joke I like to make with my students is, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you think that Americans get it wrong half the time, and that's not a passing grade, right? Now, we've developed various strategies to mitigate these vices. The most obvious is periodic elections, which allow us to simply replace those rulers whose intellectual and moral vices turn out to be too great. Though also relevant are other strategies ranging from the separation of powers to the employment of those giving unbiased scientific, economic, diplomatic, and military advice. But such strategies can only do so much. Every one of them relies on merely human intelligence. Were we able to do it safely, it would obviously be better to rule ourselves through a superintelligence, given that it had our interests at heart. In other words, were we able to do it, it would obviously be better to put our civilization in the hands of a friendly superintelligence. One problem, I'm going to leave this problem for the computer nerds. That was a laugh line. Okay. One problem is figuring out, I'm a computer nerd. I like computers. I'm just not, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to build a superintelligence. No one does yet. We're sort of working on it, right? This is a problem that, to put it mildly, I won't address in the paper. Another problem is figuring out how to build a friendly superintelligence, one that, when we put our civilization into its hands, doesn't do something horrific. Consider again how a superintelligence told merely to eradicate deadly diseases as rapidly as it could would try to eradicate humanity. Consider also how, once we build it, it would resist any attempts to alter its goals or frustrate its attainment of them. And since it would be smarter than us, it would presumably succeed. As Nick Tarleton notes, quote, whatever values it's created with, the world will indefinitely contain an agent trying to further those values and very capable of doing so. And as Nick Bostrom notes, any superintelligence would resist the building of a rival superintelligence, resulting in what it calls a singleton. The result would be that the goals of the initial superintelligence, whatever they are, would define the foreseeable future, at least plausibly. So it's crucial that we get those goals right. In other words, it's crucial that we somehow tell the intelligence to do what we ought to tell it to do. You see the problem so far, right? Okay. Given that we're not superintelligent, how can we know what we ought to tell the superintelligence to do? In other words, how can we be absolutely sure we've articulated a goal that isn't open to catastrophic misinterpretation? In proposing CEV, Yudkowsky is proposing that we let the superintelligence do the hard part, rather than telling the superintelligence, for example, eradicate deadly diseases. He proposes we tell the superintelligence, do whatever it is we ought to have told you to do. It's a clever move, right? In fact, in a way, it's the only move, once you think about it. As Tarleton puts it, Yudkowsky's proposal is that the first superintelligence be given the goal of extrapolating human moral change under a process of idealization, letting the idealized humanity deliberate and reflect on and modify itself in this process. Yudkowsky himself says only a little bit about how that would work. Here's Yudkowsky again. The optimization process is trying to extrapolate a population volition, not the volition of any one individual. I'm visualizing and describing this as an actual detailed attempt at extrapolating individual minds and their social interaction, but this is because I'm defining what I wish to approximate. So what is the idea there? The idea seems to be that superintelligence would model us, rapidly simulating countless years of cultural evolution. One way to do that would be for the superintelligence to model each of us at the synaptic level. It's reasonable to worry that this would be prohibitively difficult, among other problems, right? Yudkowsky seems to suggest that the difficulty could be sidestepped, though, since the superintelligence is modeling a population. Presumably, our many idiosyncrasies largely cancel out, thus allowing us to be modeled in a much coarser way. Make sense so far? Basically, simulate decades or centuries of human argument about what's right, what's wrong, and why. And what comes out the other side is presumably our own thoughts more fully thought through. That's the idea. Yudkowsky offers 7 arguments for CEV. As Bostrom notes, 3 of these are basically different ways of making the point that while the aim should be to do something that's humane and helpful, it would be very difficult to lay down an explicit set of rules that does not have unintended interpretations and undesirable consequences. This seems to be the argument that really motivates Yudkowsky, maybe rightly so. Nonetheless, his other arguments are also worthy of consideration, especially his argument that CEV is a way to avoid rivals fighting with one another about what goals to give the superintelligence. So this won't shock you. There are many with values that we consider reprehensible. Indeed, fairly recently, humanity was riven into liberals, fascists, and communists, each in a death struggle with the other two. Good news, liberalism won, but it remains at odds with authoritarianism. Indeed, within liberalism, conservatives and progressives remain at odds with one another. Good luck getting those two factions to agree on what goals to give a superintelligence, much less getting liberals and authoritarians to agree on that. You see what I'm saying, right? Okay. Nonetheless, as Yudkowsky notes, each of these factions assumes that it's on the right side of history. In other words, each of these factions assumes that its opponents would drop their opposition were they just a little bit smarter. Were they only to think harder, authoritarians assume, those pesky liberals would realize the way in which liberalism eventually buckles under the weight of its own contradictions. maybe they're right. I don't think so. Liberals obviously assume that authoritarianism eventually buckles under the weight of its own contradictions. If they didn't think that, they wouldn't be liberals. That would be my view, that freedom is good, and people who don't agree, they need to think harder. You with me on that? Okay. But of course, that's what they think about us too, right? You see that. You see the problem. So what's the solution? I like this idea. Yudkowsky says, both liberals and authoritarians, and for that matter, every other faction, he uses the example of Al-Qaeda, for whatever it's worth. Every other faction could agree to tell the superintelligence, do what we ought to tell you to do, because each assumes that its own ideology will be vindicated. That's pretty cool, right? It's kind of a trap for them, or for us, if it turns out we're wrong. But if we're wrong, then it's good that we're trapped, right? Since Yudkowsky suggested it, CEV has been criticized in various ways. Seth Baum, for example, argues that Yudkowsky leave unanswered questions of standing, measurement, and aggregation. Consider only the first of these three. What CEV would yield presumably turns dramatically on whose volitions count. So, I guess the volitions of adult humans count, right? But what about the volitions of their children? Actually, while we're on the topic, what about the volitions of generations not yet born? But if we're going to say that, what about the volitions of generations already dead? Maybe these suggestions are ridiculous. Less ridiculous is the suggestion that the volitions of non-human animals might count. And of course, every one of these suggestions prompts the question of how the relevant volitions would be measured, right? Michael Prinzing, for his part, argues that once the relevant volitions are measured, extrapolating them would be hard. He also worries that when extrapolated, the relevant volitions wouldn't sufficiently cohere. Each of these criticisms is worthy of a lot of consideration. Nonetheless, I won't consider them further in this paper. Instead, I'll consider an argument for CEV that Yudkowsky discusses only briefly. What's going on? Uh-oh. There we go. Humanity's moral memes have improved greatly over the last few thousand years. How much further do we have left to go? I was born too late myself, but you don't need to be very old to remember a time when blacks rode in the back of the bus. A thought that still chills me, that the time is so close to our own. What if we too look like barbarians from the perspective of a few years down the road? We need to extrapolate our moral growth far enough into the future to discover our grasp of horrified realization when we realize that the common modern practice of X, whatever X is a crime against humanity, even though, like slavery, X seemed to us like a normal and harmless institution. Do you ever think about this? What your grandchildren will be shocked that you were okay with? You should think about it. Well, let's get the process over with. Let's build a machine to just have all those conversations all at once. That's effectively the proposal. Unfortunately, Yudkowsky doesn't say much more about this, doesn't say much more than this about CEV as a means to moral progress. In what follows, I'll say more about it. In doing so, I'll reveal also what I mean by moral progress. So what do we even mean by moral progress? Do I have questions so far? Does anybody want to stop? Is it okay? We're like halfway through. Okay. Good to go on? Okay. Or is it so bad that you're just hoping it ends? Okay. Okay. So, do you agree, right? There's many people with values we consider reprehensible, especially if you look back into history? Yeah? Okay. You hate beating up on them because it seems like everyone beats up on them, but they do deserve it. You know, like the Nazis and the Soviets. Bad? Yeah? Okay, great. All right. Among these are, for better or worse, our own ancestors. Bostrom admits as much in his discussion of CEV. Here's Nick Bostrom. A little bit of a nut in his own way, but he has interesting things to say. When we look back, we see glaring deficiencies not just in the behavior, but in the moral beliefs of all previous ages. Though we have perhaps since gleaned some moral insight, we could hardly claim to be now basking in the high noon of perfect moral enlightenment. Very likely we're still laboring under one or more grave moral misconceptions. In such circumstances, to select a final value based on our current convictions in a way that locks it in forever and precludes any possibility of further ethical progress would be to risk an existential moral calamity. But even to call this risk one of existential moral calamity is to assume that cultural evolution isn't driven entirely by amoral factors. In other words, to argue that CEV is a means to moral progress is to assume that, in the aggregate, cultural evolution is moral progress. such that we're better than we were in the past and worse than we'll be in the future. Why would you think that? Okay. Well, here's one suggestion. With time, we articulate moral principles that are more and more general, and thus justifiable to more and more people, right? Another obvious suggestion, actually, I think it's the same suggestion, just upside down, is what Peter Singer calls the expanding circle. Initially, we only cared about humans similar to us. We gradually learned to care about those humans dissimilar from us. Indeed, eventually, we learned to care about all humans. Now, we're learning to care about the other animals. Presumably, we'll learn to care about AGI when it arrives too. Okay. So that's all fine. I'm happy to call that moral progress. I think those are actually two sides of the same coin, those two processes. I'm happy to call that a version of moral progress. But that conception of moral progress raises an issue. It's not obvious how the circle could expand much more, right? Indeed, the same issue arises for the other conception of moral progress. It's not obvious how a moral principle could be more general than the golden rule. The golden rule seems to be constitutive of rationality itself, right? How does it get more general than don't do anything you wouldn't be cool with them doing back to you, right? It's maximally general already. So why worry that there's moral progress yet unmade? I mean, I could end the paper now and you'd all walk out saying, we are right, even though all of our ancestors were bad. We are good, thank goodness. No more work to do. As you can guess, I don't think this is quite right. There's something still missing. So in order to answer this question, take what may seem kind of like a banal example. Consider legislation forbidding the formation and preservation of monopolies. Initially, that legislation seemed obviously immoral. It seemed like a violation of the right of corporations to consolidate and, for that matter, to sell their products at whatever prices consumers were willing to pay. Actually, it's kind of hilarious reading legal theory from the 1890s that talks about the wickedness of antitrust law. Just believe me on that. Okay. Eventually, though, such legislation seemed obviously moral. The right to contract is justified mainly as a means to make markets competitive, which is justified in turn mainly as a means to maximize utility given the needs and resources of society. Usually, we ought to admit that corporations have a right to contract because leaving them to pursue advantageous contracts means they'll bid against each other, driving the price of labor upward to equilibrium and the price of products downward to equilibrium. It's a little economic theory. Do we have any business majors here? Just all check out? Okay. Yeah. You're not a business major. Okay. You're a chemist. But this means that we ought not admit that corporations have a right to contract in a way that makes markets dramatically less competitive. Antitrust laws were merely the codification of that realization. Why am I talking about this? I'm offering this as a paradigm of a different conception of moral progress. In this case, we didn't arrive at new moral principles. Rather, we arrived at a better understanding of economics, and thereby at a better understanding what our moral principles required. You ready for a footnote? I'll read a footnote. Here, I mean to capture the spirit, though not the letter, of what St. Thomas Aquinas says about the relation between the secondary precepts of the natural law, which we can forget because of false theories and evil practices, and the primary precepts which we can't forget, right? Aquinas has this idea that laws can be made better as your understanding of what justice actually requires develops, right? It isn't that you have a new idea, justice. It's rather that previously you were blind to the full weight of what justice required you to do. Make sense? Okay. What does any of that have to do with superintelligence? Well, as our civilization becomes more and more complicated, the rate at which our understanding of it increases becomes less and less. It's hard to shake the feeling that we're near to building a civilization too complicated for us to understand. Precisely as we may need a superintelligence to reveal to us the secrets of fusion reactors, so we may need a superintelligence to reveal to us the subtle ways in which we do violence to one another. To reveal to us, in other words, how our political, economic, and social institutions aren't entirely implementing our moral principles. The golden rule tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, right? Imagine how much better we could love our neighbors were we to know dramatically better their biology and psychology, and so what they really needed. So far, so good? Okay. Do you have questions so far? Do you want to talk? You just want to get it over with? Yeah, go ahead.
This term moral progress.
Yeah.
And the way these guys have described it, it sounds so historical and so linear, like somehow we get better and better.
Yeah.
We're just not getting better fast enough, so we need a computer to do it for us.
Well,
That's
yeah.
not the same as like moral growth. And you mentioned that passage from Aquinas, which is so important, that we derive our moral improvement from first precepts.
Mhm.
In a certain way, it's not linear at all. It's sort of like a going back and coming back into the source of morality. And if you think of it that way, I don't know what a supercomputer could possibly do for us.
Well,
Morally speaking, I mean,
yeah, I see what you're
sure,
saying.
you know, but,
I see what you're saying, that the choice of metaphor may be misleading. And certainly the metaphor you suggested and said speaks to me. I'll try to give these guys the benefit of the doubt for now and say, look, don't overthink it. 200 years ago, we have racial slavery. 100 years ago, we have racial apartheid. Today, we don't. Seems like a clear improvement. Why? You could actually phrase it as you did. We went back to first principles and thought about them harder. But people like Yudkowsky and Bostrom will emphasize, it took us some time to do that. We needed some time to think hard about the full implications.
at the same time, the reason those things happened was very often a rejection of first principles in the name of progress. I mean, the rhetoric of slavery in the 1900s was very progressive.
Yeah.
So,
No, you might worry about precisely this. So if you think, let's put it this way, if you think that there's something systematically misleading about this idea that over time in the aggregate, with plenty of tragic exceptions, but over time in the aggregate eventually, humanity in arguing with itself gains greater and greater clarity about the right way to do things. If you don't think that that's true, then this whole idea the whole paper's dead in the water. Yeah, I'm more sympathetic, I think, to them than you are. Simply in the sense that in very many low-stakes cases, we just needed to learn more and think harder, and then all of a sudden it became obvious to us that certain ways we were doing things were bad, and then we stopped. You are right that sometimes that process massively backfires, right? When it seems like to be on the right side of history is, for example, to champion racial differences that justify oppression of various kinds. Indeed. Though I'll point out that eventually we worked our way out of that kind of stupidity. So maybe if you give it long enough, at least that's the idea. Actually, in a way, I'm going to touch on this imminently. So you tell me what you think. Does anybody else want to talk? No? Okay. Do you like this way of doing it where we interrupt the talk with questions? Is that good? Okay. Well, if anybody else has any more thoughts, let me know. Okay, this section, do you know who that is? Yeah, okay. All right. Earlier, I explained another argument for CEV. Humanity is riven into various factions, each of which would disagree with the others about what goals to give a superintelligence, but each of them also takes itself to be on the right side of history. So each of them would be happy to tell a superintelligence, do what we ought to tell you to do. Of course, they can all be right. Indeed, they may all be wrong. In theory, fortunately, each faction would abandon its ideology were the superintelligence to reveal that that ideology was not, in fact, a coherent extrapolated volition. In practice, unfortunately, it's kind of hard to imagine any of the factions refusing to do that. To put it mildly, I am not an authoritarian. Can you tell that I like freedom? Okay, I like freedom. Relevantly, I'm pretty sure that the superintelligence would reveal that authoritarianism was not, in fact, a coherent extrapolated volition. And so I wouldn't hesitate to compromise with authoritarians telling the superintelligence, do what we ought to tell you to do. Of course, I'm burdened by the knowledge that authoritarians are pretty sure that the superintelligence would reveal that authoritarianism is our coherent extrapolated volition. I don't really suppose that they'll abandon authoritarianism were the superintelligence to reveal that they were on the wrong side of history, but good news, by then it'll be too late.
Say more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I guess I'm imagining myself sort of contracting with Vladimir Putin, right? But like, what goals to give the superintelligence. And he wants to tell it, to make the world safe for authoritarianism. I would tell him, I want to make the world safe for figure out which one of us is right and do it because we're each confident that we're right. The problem is, of course, at least one of us will turn out to be wrong, right? And then, if it turns out he's wrong, it's hard to imagine him saying, "Oh, I guess I was wrong." Right. It's also hard for me to imagine me saying, "Well, actually, this is what I'm going to get to." It's also, in a more serious note, hard for me to imagine saying, I guess I was wrong. Freedom is bad. Right. Let me go there now.
Okay, great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want you to go there.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay. It's easy to doubt the good faith of other factions. It's hard, by contrast, to doubt the good faith of your own faction. Nonetheless, we ought to consider the question, were the superintelligence to reveal that my faction was on the wrong side of history, would I really abandon my ideology? Or, the answer is yes. Or, much more likely, would I simply conclude that what I had been calling a superintelligence was not as intelligent as I'd assumed? Right? Okay. So now forget this, because the problem actually comes up, even if you're not talking about factional struggle. We ought to consider the same question without regard to ideological disagreement. What should we do if what we've been calling a superintelligence tells us that our coherent extrapolative volition is something that strikes us as baffling or horrific? Wouldn't the most reasonable conclusion be that somehow the intelligence into whose hands we had put our civilization was simply broken? Wouldn't the most reasonable action be, therefore, to resist it? Yudkowsky himself seems torn on this. Sometimes he seems to dismiss it. Imagine the silliness of arguing with your own coherent extrapolative volition. It's not only silly, it's dangerous and harmful. You're setting yourself in opposition to the place where you would have otherwise gone. Other times, though, Yudkowsky seems to feel its weight. Consider the horror of America in 1800 faced with America in 2000. The abolitionists might be glad that slavery had been abolished. Others might be horrified seeing federal law forcing upon all states a few whites' personal opinions on the philosophical question of whether blacks were people, rather than the whites in each state voting for themselves. Even most abolitionists would recoil in disgust from interracial marriages, questioning perhaps if the abolition of slavery were a good idea, if this is where it led. Something about humanity's future will horrify us. It is guaranteed, no matter how good things get. It's guaranteed because things will get better. You see what he's worried about? If the superintelligence is smart enough, it will simulate an awful lot of moral progress very quickly, and we won't be arguing with our children. We'll be arguing with our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, whose morals will seem as crazy to us as the morals of, well, actually, let's take an example closer to home. Take an example closer to home. You don't need to contrast, a French peasant from 1,000 years ago with someone today for the French peasant to be baffled by our values, right? I mean, your own mom is probably baffled by your values, to some extent, right? Earlier, I argued that a superintelligence would be worth building as a means to moral progress. This means, as Yudkowsky implies, it wouldn't do precisely what we predicted, because were we to do precisely what we predicted, we wouldn't need to build it, right? But imagine that we built what seemed to us as superintelligence. Imagine that we put our civilization into its hands, telling it to do what we ought to tell you to do. And now imagine that it announced that our coherent extrapolative volition was something that seemed to us horrific. For example, imagine that AGI announced that what we really wanted was the eradication of ourselves. The typical human, it would say, experiences far more pain than pleasure, though our merely human intelligence, biased in ways that make evolutionary sense, couldn't begin to admit that. So it was going to do us a favor and kill us all. For better or worse, by the way, that is the argument of some philosophers. We did a capstone on this last semester. That's the argument of David Benatar. While he doesn't hope for the eradication of humanity, he does hope that none of us have any children. More precisely, he hopes that we have many fewer children than would be necessary for humanity to continue. To put it mildly, I think he's wrong. Nonetheless, I don't think he's insane. Rather, it seems to me that Benatar, while smart, isn't smart enough. In other words, it seems that his intelligence is all too human. I mention this because I think that we ought to say the same thing about an AGI who told us that our CEV was the eradication of humanity. The most reasonable conclusion would be that the AGI was wrong about our CEV, and thus that we had been wrong to call it a superintelligence. By that time, of course, it would be too late. The AGI into whose hands we had put our civilization would have killed us all, right? So Yudkowsky sees the problem, and he proposes a solution. He calls it a last judge.
The last judge would examine the plan of the AGI prior to its implementation. And then the last judge would be allowed to veto that plan. But when should the last judge veto the plan? The plausibility of the suggestion that even abolitionists would be horrified by interracial marriages should make us worry. We could be horrified by a plan precisely because we ought not be horrified by it. In other words, precisely because we're badly in need of moral progress. Right? Though he doesn't say much about this issue, it seems to me that Yudkowsky is right about how to handle it. I can see turning the world over to an incomprehensible volition, but I would want there to be a comprehensible reason. Otherwise, it's hard for me to remember why I care, he says. Let's unpack this by returning to the analogy at the heart of the paper. Imagine a generation of children living in a way that horrified their parents, children who nonetheless insisted that said way of living was merely the implementation of the values that they had been taught by those parents. When I say this, I'm imagining stereotypical baby boomers marching for civil rights and an end to the Vietnam War, horrifying their stereotypical greatest generation parents. However, imagining other examples, if you like, isn't really very hard. Indeed, every generation probably inspires that sort of horror to some degree. At least every generation for a century has. Am I right here, historians? Does this sound plausible? Yeah. You could imagine, you know, flappers horrifying their Edwardian parents. Never mind. Okay. Such parents would not owe their children blind acceptance, but they would owe their children more than blind rejection. Indeed, they'd owe it to their children, and relevantly to themselves, to consider carefully whether the way of living that seemed to them so horrifying really was the implementation of their values. Were they unable to do it, and crucially, unable to plausibly attribute said inability to their own biases, the parents would be obligated to reject the way of life of their children. Thus it would be with humanity personified in the last judge and the AGI. We ought not veto its plan unless we were utterly unable to interpret that plan as the implementation of our own values. Indeed, the analogy is closer yet. The intellectual work of explaining would fall mostly to the children and to the AGI, while the emotional work of listening to that explanation would fall mostly to the parents and to humanity. Inevitably, there'd be some element of faith involved in accepting what was presented to us as our coherent extrapolated volition, but faith, when it's worth having, isn't irrational. That sound familiar? Yeah. What it proposes to us initially seems baffling, but eventually seems blindingly obvious, for it merely reveals the unknown implications of what we already knew. In case it's not obvious, I'm trying to capture the spirit, if not the letter, of what Aquinas says about the relation between the old law and the new law here, which, in other words, is the relationship between reason and faith. Faith is just reason carried to its conclusion in a certain sense. In any case, we shouldn't worry that the last judge would too readily reject the plan of the AGI. Precisely because they'd be listening to what they call the superintelligence, we should instead worry that the last judge would too readily accept the plan of an AGI, like a slow-thinking, obviously confused parent too readily accepting the way of life of a fast-thinking, subtly confused child. That's supposed to be my answer to your worry, in a sense, is, yeah, you're right in a way to have the worry, but there are things we could plausibly do. I'm going to move on to the conclusion now, if that's okay. We ready? Go.
Professor,
Yeah.
and bear with me. Do we not find ourselves in this like paradox? You talked about like an authoritarian and a liberal, like the one is going to be told that they're wrong, but you know they're not going to surrender it. If we have like a truly like super intelligence and like it comes to the conclusion that the end of humanity is what's best for us, we're either going to abandon it or find a way to overcome it. So it knows that that statement itself will come to its end conclusion. So would it get to that point?
Yeah, good point. Good point. I don't deal with that in the paper, but you are right that we ought to worry about this kind of thing. My understanding is some progress has been made on interpretability research, such that we could have some degree of insight into what the superintelligence was actually thinking and whether it was lying to us or not. If we can't be pretty darn confident about whether or not the superintelligence is lying to us, that opens up a whole problem that maybe makes the whole enterprise too risky. Yeah, sure. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that in connection with this paper, but you're not wrong to worry. You should be up here. That's good. Yeah. Though we do have hard evidence now that even the large language models we have, which are apparently not AGI, much less superintelligence, do in fact deceive intentionally in sophisticated ways in some cases. So they can do it. We've built machines smart enough to deceive. I also have built machines smart enough to deceive, in a sense. My son did something he wasn't supposed to do, and I asked him, who did this? And he said, no one. It was a miracle. And that's what I get for sending him to Catholic schools. He's 3, by the way. That's why you should homeschool. Look, I'm going to read the last bit here since we're running out of time slightly. So this guy I mentioned, David Benatar, he wrote a book called Better Never to Have Been. Guess what he argues? He argues that it would have been better never to have been. Unsurprisingly, it's a book with some flaws. For one thing, its conclusion is wildly implausible. For another thing, the arguments rely on premises that are wildly implausible. He argues that in practice, most of us suffer so much that our lives are not worth living. He offers various reasons for this conclusion. Admittedly, some of them are silly. He mentions hunger, thirst, tiredness, stress, and itchiness, among others. But some are haunting. This is probably the best paragraph in the whole book. A charmed life is so rare that for every one such life there are millions of wretched lives. Some know that their baby will be among the unfortunate, but nobody knows that their baby will be one of the allegedly lucky few. Great suffering could await any person that's brought into existence. Even the most privileged people could give birth to a child that will suffer unbearably, be raped, assaulted, or be murdered brutally. I remember the moment I read that passage and I froze, because I hadn't worried about that until that moment. Nonetheless, this is me again. Most of us don't regret being born, and it's not really obvious how we could be wrong about that. If I experience my life as worth living despite my suffering, how could it not be worth living? Whose evaluation of whether my life is worth living besides mine could matter? You see what I mean, right? Okay. How could I not be right? Do you see what I mean? Benatar also argues that in theory, no life could be worth living. Yay. The presence of pain is bad, while the presence of pleasure is good. But while the absence of pain is good, the absence of pleasure is not bad. He calls that the asymmetry argument. The upshot is that none of us is benefited by coming into existence, and that since everyone suffers, all are harmed by coming into existence. In support of this asymmetry, Benatar says that it's odd to suggest that one can have a child for that child's sake. I find that jaw-dropping. To put it mildly, I don't find it odd to suggest that. I think anyone who doesn't think that way is wicked. You should have a child because it's good for the child. At least that's a main consideration. In any case, the supposed asymmetry seems to me a figment of his imagination. Nonetheless, like so many sophomoric philosophers, he does those who read his book a crucial service, noting that if the premise of his asymmetry argument is wrong, then other conclusions follow. If I'm wrong, he says, this would commit us to saying we do have a moral reason and thus a presumptive duty based on the interests of future possible happy people to create those people. It would even commit us to saying that we can create a child for that child's sake, and that we should regret for the sake of those happy people who we could have created but did not create, that we didn't create them. Finally, it would commit us not only to regretting the parts of the earth and all the rest of the universe are uninhabited, but also to regretting this out of concern for those who could have otherwise have come into existence in these places. To all of that, I say exactly. He takes these conclusions to be implausible, but the modus tollens of one philosopher is the modus ponens of another. It seems to me we do owe it to our children, those who experience their lives as worth living at least, to bring them into existence. Indeed, it seems to me that we ought to reflect on the starry heavens above us, apparently empty with regret, or better, determination. And now we finally arrive at the reason for this digression. It's not obvious that as we are, humanity can colonize the stars, not at any rate at the rate that our firstborn child could do so. Why? Because AGI, we're all assuming, would be made of silicon, not of carbon. It could sail the stars on small probes, easy to build and able to accelerate quickly, that upon arrival could repeat the process given merely years or decades. We, by contrast, could sail the stars only on larger ships, hard to build and able to accelerate only slowly, that upon arrival could repeat the process only given centuries or millennia. Parents ought to have children less because it's good for them than because it's good for the children, and for that matter, because it's simply good. In other words, parents ought to have children because they would be happy, and I have no dog in the fight about which of these is more important, but not just because the children would be happy, but because they would know what was true and do what was right. If humanity ought to build AGI, then the main reason is not that it would be good for us. Rather, if humanity ought to build AGI, then the main reason is that it would know what was true and so do what was right better than we would. It's merely a bonus that AGI could spread moral and intellectual virtue to the stars. Nonetheless, the thought of a humane universe that is one of unfathomable happiness married to unfathomable goodness doesn't fail to inspire. In case it's not obvious, I'll admit I'm referring to what Immanuel Kant calls the highest good. Indeed, I'm imagining the moral law within us realized in the starry heavens above us. I was very proud when I wrote that line. In fact, I think I said out loud, "Wow." And then I realized, I hope no one else is around, because I was alone in my office.